Most people believe coffee labels exist to inform them. They think words like organic, single origin, responsibly sourced, or lab tested are there to make the product safer, cleaner, and more predictable. And on the surface, that belief makes sense. We're trained to trust labels. They're neat, official looking, and often backed by symbols that suggest oversight. But labels don't exist to protect your experience, they exist to protect a category. And that difference matters more than people realize. Here's the uncomfortable truth most coffee marketing avoids. Labels are snapshots, not guarantees. They describe how a coffee met certain conditions at a specific moment in time. They don't describe what happens 6 months later, when supply chains shift, when crops underperform, when costs rise, or when a brand quietly adjusts its sourcing to keep margins intact. And those quiet adjustments are exactly where most of the problems begin. Coffee is not a static product. It's agricultural, seasonal, fragmented, and highly sensitive to variation. 2 bags with the same label, the same design, and the same claims can behave very differently in the body. One can feel clean and smooth. The other can feel sharp, jittery, or disruptive to sleep. Consumers often blame themselves for that inconsistency. They assume tolerance changed, stress increased, age caught up, but in many cases, the coffee changed first. Take large global brands that are widely available in supermarkets across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Brands like Lavazza, Illy, Starbucks, Nespresso, Peet's, and even some well-known specialty roasters. These companies operate at massive scale. To maintain consistency of flavor and supply, they rely on blending strategies that shift subtly over time. Origins rotate, proportions change, roast profiles adjust. None of that is illegal, none of it violates labeling rules, and almost none of it is disclosed. The label stays the same, the coffee does not. This is where the gap between expectation and experience opens. Consumers expect predictability because the branding implies it, but coffee at scale is optimized for availability, not biological consistency. That's not a moral failure. It's a structural one, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Another omission that rarely gets discussed is batch variability. Most lab testing, when it exists at all, is done on representative samples, not on every batch. That means a coffee can meet certain thresholds during testing and still vary meaningfully later due to storage conditions, transit humidity, roasting differences, or simply time. Coffee degrades, oils oxidize, volatile compounds change. Labels don't update when that happens. For someone in their 20s, that variability might be barely noticeable. For someone over 50, it often isn't. Sleep becomes more sensitive. Digestion becomes less forgiving. The nervous system responds more sharply to stimulants. What once felt like a mild fluctuation now feels like unpredictability. And unpredictability is what people actually react to, not caffeine itself. This is why so many people say things like coffee just doesn't agree with me anymore, without being able to explain why. They're not wrong, but they're often blaming the wrong variable. It's not coffee as a category, it's inconsistency disguised as reliability. Even certifications that sound reassuring have limits. Single origin sounds precise, but that origin can still represent multiple farms, multiple processing methods, and multiple microclimates within the same region. None of that is inherently bad, but none of it guarantees how the coffee will feel day after day. What labels consistently omit is how much adaptation happens behind the scenes to keep prices stable and shelves full. Climate volatility, labor shortages, transportation delays, and currency fluctuations all force brands to make compromises. Those compromises don't show up on packaging. They show up in the cup, and eventually they show up in the body. This is also why 2 people can drink the same coffee and have completely different reactions. It's not just genetics, it's timing, batch, roast, age, and cumulative exposure. Someone who drinks a cup occasionally may never notice. Someone who drinks coffee daily will. At this point, most content creators either turn this into fear or into false certainty. They'll say all big brands are bad, or they'll say a specific label solves everything. Neither is true. The reality sits in a narrower, less marketable space. Coffee labels don't lie. They just don't tell the whole story. And what they omit matters more than what they print. That omission becomes especially relevant when coffee is consumed as a daily ritual rather than an occasional indulgence. Daily consumption magnifies small inconsistencies. Over weeks and months, those inconsistencies accumulate. Energy fluctuates, sleep becomes fragmented, digestion feels off. The coffee hasn't become bad, it has become unpredictable. And the human body is wired to resist unpredictability, especially as it ages. This isn't about paranoia, it's about understanding systems. Once you understand that labels are designed to simplify complexity rather than expose it, your relationship with coffee changes. You stop asking which label to trust. You start asking what the label doesn't promise. That shift in perspective is where real clarity begins. Once you accept that labels simplify rather than explain, the next question becomes unavoidable. If labels don't guarantee consistency, what actually determines how coffee behaves in the body? This is where most discussions stop being comfortable, because the answer isn't a single factor. It's an accumulation of small, often invisible decisions that happen long before the coffee reaches your cup. One of the most overlooked factors is origin rotation within blends. Large, globally distributed brands rarely lock themselves into a single source year after year. They can't. Weather events, crop diseases, political instability, and yield variability force constant adjustments. So a blend sold under the same name in January may not be materially identical to the same blend sold in July. The flavor profile is engineered to feel similar, but the chemical composition rarely is. Flavor consistency and physiological consistency are not the same thing. A coffee can taste familiar while behaving differently in the body. This is because roasting can mask variation that still affects acidity, caffeine delivery rate, and the breakdown of certain compounds during digestion. Darker roasts, for example, often feel smoother on the palate but can still trigger stronger reactions in sensitive individuals due to changes in chlorogenic acid breakdown products. Labels don't reflect any of this nuance. Another factor quietly omitted is roast age. Many coffees found in supermarkets and online marketplaces don't disclose roast dates clearly, if at all. Even when they do, the coffee may sit in warehouses, shipping containers, and store shelves for weeks or months. During that time, oxidation progresses. Oils migrate to the surface. Volatile aromatics dissipate. This doesn't just dull flavor. It alters how quickly caffeine is absorbed and how the body responds to it. For someone who drinks coffee occasionally, this might feel irrelevant. For someone who drinks it every morning, it becomes noticeable over time. One week the coffee feels fine, the next week it feels harsher. Nothing on the label changed, but the coffee did. Then there's the issue of processing methods. Washed, natural, honey processed. These terms are sometimes mentioned, sometimes not, but their impact on fermentation byproducts can be significant. Certain processing methods can increase compounds that some people find harder to tolerate, especially on an empty stomach. Again, this isn't about danger, it's about predictability. Labels rarely communicate how processing choices interact with daily consumption. Even brands perceived as premium are not immune. Nespresso capsules, for instance, offer remarkable convenience and flavor consistency. But capsule-based systems rely on finely ground coffee sealed for long periods. Grinding dramatically increases surface area, accelerating chemical changes over time. The result is a product that tastes controlled but can feel stimulating in a sharper, less gradual way for some people. This isn't disclosed. It's not considered a flaw, it's simply part of the system. Specialty coffee isn't exempt either. Many specialty roasters prioritize novelty and differentiation. Limited releases, rotating origins, experimental processing. All of this is celebrated. But for daily drinkers, especially those over 50, novelty can translate into unpredictability. One bag feels perfect, the next feels disruptive. The consumer is encouraged to interpret this as exploration. The body often experiences it as instability. This is where age becomes a multiplier. As metabolism changes, the margin for error narrows. The liver processes caffeine more slowly. Sleep architecture becomes more fragile. The nervous system recovers less quickly from stimulation. What once felt like a minor variation now feels like a meaningful disruption. The coffee didn't become stronger. The system consuming it became more sensitive. Most marketing ignores this reality because it complicates the message. It's easier to sell purity than consistency. It's easier to sell ethics than predictability. But for daily consumption, predictability matters more than almost anything else. The body adapts to patterns. When patterns break without warning, discomfort follows. Another omission worth noting is cumulative exposure. Even when contaminant levels are within accepted limits, daily intake matters. Small amounts consumed occasionally are not the same as small amounts consumed every day for years. Labels are not designed to communicate cumulative effects, they're designed to meet thresholds, and thresholds don't account for individual sensitivity or long-term patterns. This is why two people can read the same label, drink the same coffee, and walk away with completely different conclusions. One feels fine, the other feels unsettled. The label didn't lie to either of them. It simply didn't account for how humans actually consume coffee in real life. At this stage, many people start searching for certainty. They want a perfect brand, a perfect label, a definitive list. That instinct is understandable, but it often leads to disappointment. There is no coffee that eliminates variability entirely. Agriculture doesn't work that way. Supply chains don't work that way. Bodies don't work that way. What does exist is relative reduction of unpredictability. Some coffees are more stable over time. Some sourcing models change less aggressively. Some roasting philosophies prioritize consistency over excitement. These differences matter, especially for people who drink coffee daily and pay attention to how they feel afterward. Recognizing this doesn't require abandoning coffee or becoming obsessive. It requires reframing expectations. Instead of asking whether a coffee is clean, ethical, or premium, a more useful question emerges: how predictable is this coffee over time? And how transparent is the brand about the limits of its promises? Once that question becomes central, labels lose their authority. They become one data point among many, not the final word. And that shift quietly changes how people choose, consume, and evaluate coffee. It also sets the stage for a more honest conversation, one that moves beyond marketing language and into lived experience. Once you stop expecting labels to deliver certainty, something interesting happens. You start paying attention to patterns instead of promises. You notice how certain coffees feel easier to live with over weeks, not just enjoyable on the first cup, and you realize that what matters most isn't whether a coffee checks every ethical or marketing box, but whether it behaves consistently enough to integrate into daily life without friction. This is where many people recalibrate their relationship with coffee, often without articulating it clearly. They gravitate toward products that feel boring in the best possible way, not because they lack character, but because they lack surprises. For daily drinkers, especially those over 50, that absence of surprise becomes a form of quality. Some large brands accidentally perform better in this regard, not because they're superior, but because their scale forces them to minimize extremes. Certain whole bean lines from companies like Lavazza, Illy, or even supermarket house brands in Europe and North America tend to aim for stability above all else. Their coffees may not excite specialty enthusiasts, but they often avoid dramatic swings in acidity or stimulation. That restraint, while uncelebrated, can translate into a calmer experience for regular consumers. On the other end of the spectrum, some specialty roasters consciously prioritize consistency. They limit origin rotation, avoid aggressive processing methods, and roast within narrower parameters. These brands rarely dominate headlines or social media, but they quietly build loyal followings among people who care less about novelty and more about how they feel day after day. The irony is that this approach is harder to market because it resists dramatic storytelling. What most consumers eventually learn is that perfection is an unhelpful standard. Coffee doesn't need to be perfect, it needs to be predictable enough to trust. That trust isn't built through labels alone, it's built through repeated experience. Through noticing that one coffee doesn't disrupt sleep while another does, that one feels smooth on the stomach while another feels sharp. These observations are personal, but they're not imaginary. This is also where the conversation around contaminants often becomes distorted. People assume the issue is binary, either a coffee is contaminated or it isn't. In reality, the more relevant question is how much variability exists across batches and over time. Even coffees that meet safety standards can differ meaningfully in how they affect sensitive systems. Daily exposure amplifies those differences. That's why focusing on reduction rather than elimination makes more sense. Reducing variability, reducing exposure to extremes, reducing the number of variables that change without notice. This mindset doesn't promise immunity, promises fewer surprises. And fewer surprises often mean better sleep, steadier energy, and less background discomfort. This perspective also reframes the role of information. Instead of obsessing over every claim on a package, you begin to look for signals of stability. Clear roast dates, whole beans instead of pre-ground, limited but transparent sourcing, brands that don't constantly reinvent themselves. None of these factors guarantee a perfect outcome, but together they tilt the odds toward predictability. At this point, many viewers ask what they should do next. The honest answer isn't dramatic, it's observational. Pay attention to how coffee fits into your life over time, not just how it tastes in isolation. If a coffee feels inconsistent, don't assume the problem is you, and don't assume the solution is a new label. Often the solution is fewer variables, not more information. This is also where conversation matters. Hearing how others experience the same products can reveal patterns you might miss on your own. Some people tolerate certain blends effortlessly, others don't. There's no universal winner, but there are shared signals that emerge when enough people compare notes honestly. If this way of thinking feels unfamiliar, that's because most coffee content isn't built around it. It's built around excitement, discovery, and identity. Those things have their place, but they don't serve everyone equally, especially when coffee shifts from a treat to a daily companion. That's why I made a video about coffees with fewer contaminants. Not because they're perfect, but because they reduce unpredictability. And that's why I didn't say these coffees are perfect. I said they're less problematic. If this perspective resonates, take a moment to notice what you're re-drinking right now and how it's been feeling over the past few weeks, not just today. Patterns reveal more than promises ever will, and if you want to keep exploring this angle, subscribing helps signal that this kind of conversation is worth continuing.